often that we see a solar eclipse in real life, you know what's just as rare? Seeing an eclipse like this in a video game. One of the only video games I can even think of that has such a thing is Okami. It features both a partial and a total solar eclipse. So today I pose the question, what changes in the weather during Okami's eclipse? Let's do a case study! Why not? Well, seemingly very little changes besides the fact that the world goes dark. Which, to be fair, does happen when the moon blocks the sun. If you've ever experienced an eclipse where the moon is partially covering the sun to a great degree, the sky gets a bit darker. This isn't too noticeable until the moon covers around 90% of the sun's light. Truth be told, the coverage would have to be greater than 90% before we'd notice a difference with our eyes. Otherwise, most of us would probably say it's a normal sunny day. So besides looking cool, what exactly happens when there's a solar eclipse in this game? The sun completely disappears, and Amaterasu loses all of her powers thanks to the game's main antagonist, but that's a game design choice. The sun still exists during an eclipse, we just can't see it briefly, save for its outermost layer. Or, well, that's what we should see in Okami, but we don't. I suspect this has to do with the graphical style of the game rather than anything else. Most of the objects in the game aren't bright in the way the sun would be out here in the real world. Don't get me wrong, the game is lovely in terms of its graphics, it's by far one of my favorites, but I can't deny that it doesn't make for the most accurate picture of the sun. Okay, so besides that, does anything else happen? Well, in the game, not really. It's just dark for a bit, then when Amaterasu beats the final boss, the sun comes out again, and all is well and good in the universe. If you've never experienced an eclipse before, that might seem pretty reasonable. Which, that's pretty fair. A short solar eclipse has minimal effects on the environment. However, we should still see some noticeable effects. How many? Well, at least a couple of things, truthfully. I have a few things in mind as a meteorologist, but first, I'll talk about one that's a little out of my depth, but one that I did have to learn about during my time as a student, so you get to be educated right along with me. Let's get into it. One impact we should see from the eclipse in Okami, but don't, is the impact on the animals. When the skies get darker, you can often hear nocturnal creatures starting to awaken since it's getting dark, and the diurnal animals preparing to rest. During a more recent eclipse, I distinctly remember hearing crickets chirping because they thought the sun was going down. Then cue all the animals being really confused when the daylight started increasing like the sun was rising. It's often during total eclipses that we're more likely to see this happen, but it can also occur during a partial eclipse if the skies get dark enough. This tends to throw off the animals' cycles for a little while, but they usually get back on track quickly enough. We love eclipse fun facts. But wait a minute, I'm a meteorologist, not a biologist. Why am I talking about animals? This relates to a concept in meteorology called the diurnal cycle. It's just a fancy term for saying the day and night cycle, it's nothing too elaborate. We discuss this a lot in meteorology since weather can change as a result of the day turning to night. While animal behavior is not a core meteorological topic, it is something my professors thought we should know, and you should too. Let's get into more of the weather side of things before I completely derail this conversation though. You might be asking yourselves the question that meteorologists like myself have been asking for ages. Does an eclipse have any impact on the weather? And the answer to that is a bit complicated, but I will try my best to break it down for you. We've done some studies on this, and while we're still doing research, we do have some general answers we can provide. Something else that happens during an eclipse, more so weather-related than animal-related, that we kind of see in Okami if we squint hard enough, is a reduction in temperature. See, when the moon blocks out the sun, even partially, it blocks out not only light from the sun, but also incoming solar radiation, or insolation. Yes, this is exactly what it sounds like. It's radiation that originates from the sun and travels to Earth. This is the main way that the Earth's surface heats up. What happens when the sun is gone? The temperature will decrease by at least a few degrees depending on the location and the time of year. During a normal eclipse, assuming that the sun is entirely covered, an environment could drop in temperature around 5 to 10 degrees. I say we kind of see this in games since the darkness makes things look a bit colder, namely the environments being in cooler tones than they otherwise would be. Like I said, you kind of have to squint to see it, but it might be portrayed here. Weather-wise, there are other things that should be portrayed in Okami that seemingly aren't. One such thing is the wind! Wait, seriously? The wind? Yes, you heard me correctly. The wind is formed by a pressure gradient force, which is the change in atmospheric pressure over a distance. Pressure can change when sunlight is present, as that sunlight can change the air stability. When the sun disappears, wind speeds tend to decrease due to lower pressure differences. Now, I'm not saying we have no winds. We frequently can and do have wind at night, but they will be a lot calmer than they would be during the day when the sun is actively changing the pressure and stability of the atmosphere. If you don't believe me, if you've ever looked at the difference between your wind speeds during the day and during the night, even during strong wind events, wind speeds at night tend to be a little bit less severe than they would be during the day. Now wait a minute, what exactly do we mean when we say a change in atmospheric stability? Most of the time, the atmosphere lives in this state of what we call conditional instability. If you're looking at me like I have 5 heads, honestly, that's completely fair. What does it mean to have a conditionally unstable atmosphere? It means that the environmental lapse rate is in between the moist adiabatic lapse rate and the dry adiabatic lapse rate. Okay, now I'm really getting into the weeds. What on earth are those things? Don't worry, I'm going to get us through this in a non-complicated manner. At least I hope so. A lapse rate is the change in temperature over a vertical distance, usually with the units of degrees Celsius per kilometer. So when I talk about the environmental lapse rate, I'm talking about the decrease in temperature over a vertical distance at a given location and time. This value can vary greatly depending on where you are and what conditions are at a location. For example, the lapse rate in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania is very likely not the same as the lapse rate in Chicago, Illinois. While both are cities, they're far apart from each other and the landscape around each city varies greatly. It's going to be rare that those lapse rates are the same. So if the environmental lapse rate has to be between the moist and dry adiabatic lapse rate, what exactly are those values? Well, the moist adiabatic lapse rate is the decrease of temperature of a parcel of a water-saturated air that rises in the atmosphere. This value, unfortunately, also varies depending on the temperature and pressure of said parcel of saturated air. In classes, we'd often use a value of 5 degrees Celsius per kilometer, but that's not a definitive value. If it helps you to know, the Malur, or moist adiabatic lapse rate, can be between 3.6 to 9.2 degrees Celsius per kilometer. It usually cannot exceed the number of 9.2 degrees Celsius per kilometer. If you're asking why not, well, that's because the dry adiabatic lapse rate has a static value of 9.8 degrees Celsius per kilometer. So any number getting too close to that would be considered the dry adiabatic lapse rate. Yeah, the Dowler is the increase of the temperature of a parcel of air that rises in the atmosphere without exchanging energy with the surrounding air, which, as you could probably imagine, doesn't happen all that often. But under the assumption that it does, the lapse rate is 9.8 degrees Celsius per kilometer. So this means the environmental lapse rate, for the atmosphere to be conditionally unstable, like it normally is, has to be between the Malur and the Dowler. For the atmosphere to be considered completely unstable, the environmental lapse rate has to be greater than the Dowler. For an atmosphere to be completely stable, the environmental lapse rate has to be less than the Malur. Why, can you blame me? Saying dry adiabatic lapse rate, moist adiabatic lapse rate a million times, that gets old real fast. Yes, we abbreviate these things. So what exactly should happen to stability during an eclipse then? Well, usually the sun heats up an air parcel, forcing it to rise. Without the sun, parcels don't exactly have an easy method of gaining heat for said parcel to rise. Given this, I suspect the atmosphere would end up being more stable than it would be otherwise. When we have a stable atmosphere, we get less weather. Usually weather occurs when the atmosphere is conditionally unstable or straight up unstable, not when it is stable. Overall, weather should be nice and calm. Yet, if we look at Okami, I noticed something a bit strange. See, the game actually shows us the beginning stages of this eclipse shortly after we complete the penultimate dungeon. The sun is covered partially, I'll give them that, but this isn't covered quite as well as it should be for there to be any noticeable impacts on the weather, or just as important, on the amount of daylight the human eye would see. Granted, my eyes haven't been checked in a minute, but I don't think that this little chunk of the moon covers 90% of the sun. The sky should not be darker, yet it is. Weather shouldn't be impacted yet, but it seems to be starting to be impacted. What gives? Well, I did say the human eye wouldn't notice a difference unless there was 90% coverage. But we're not playing as a human in this game. We're a wolf. Look, I'm no biologist or a zoologist, anything of the sort. I study the weather, not animals. But that's where this magical invention known as the internet can help us out a little bit. Wolves, you see, have excellent night vision. It's just as good as their daytime vision, in fact. While wolves are not strictly nocturnal animals, they do tend to be more active in times of lower light, such as dawn, dusk, and twilight. Given that an eclipse causes there to be less light than there normally is, perhaps it's possible that a wolf would notice a change in daylight from an eclipse before a human eye could. A wolf's eye might not need the sun to be covered to a great extent for them to notice a difference. Again, not a biologist, and I can't find any studies suggesting this, but it's a theory to keep this whole part of the story afloat. I'm doing my best here. Let me see, is there anything else? Nope, that's all my notes out on the subject. Thank you all so much for watching. If you want to see more content like this, be sure to subscribe. I have more on the docket that I can't wait to share with you. I will see you all in the next one. Have a good day, everybody.